All right, it's about that time. Welcome to this session entitled Remembering Joseph Smith's Presidential Campaign. We're glad you're with us for this. We've got two fantastic papers and presenters. Today, our first presenter is Derek R. Sainsbury. He holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Utah and a MPA from Brigham Young University. Also a PhD in American History from the University of Utah. He has taught and administered in the seminaries and institutes of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for 25 years. Currently, he teaches in the Church History and Doctrine Department at Brigham Young University. He is the author of the book Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. Additionally, he is the author of several articles and conference papers on the intersections of politics and the Latter-day Saint history. He is currently researching and writing a dual biography of Joseph Smith and Robert F. Kennedy, evaluating their lives, campaigns, assassinations, and legacies. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Tana Lynn Rutherford at the Maxwell Institute currently, and I heard Derek present on his forthcoming book, and it's exciting, and so look forward to what's ahead. Just concluding Derek Sainsbury's biography here. He is married to Meredith Pettit, and they live in Bountiful, Utah, with their 3 sons. So we'll turn the time over to Derek. Thanks.
Hello. In 1895, 80-year-old Nancy Naomi Tracy described in one sentence her experience since joining the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints 60 years earlier. Quote, "We have not been allowed the liberty to worship as we please," end quote. She had not, however, been a passive victim. Rather, she had fought for religious freedom, most notably as the only female electioneer of Joseph Smith's 1844 presidential campaign. Her experience offers a novel lens on the limits of religious freedom in the United States and the unique Latter-day Saint experience to obtain it. Nancy Naomi Alexander was born in 1816 in upstate New York. She excelled in school and was offered a contract to teach at just 16 years old. Instead, that same year, she met and married 22-year-old Moses Tracy. The young couple inherited a legacy of fathers and grandfathers who fought in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution, and with that, the young republic's rights to life, liberty, property, and religious freedom. However, those rights began to fade 2 years later when in 1834 they joined the Church of Jesus Christ and resettled with the Saints in Kirtland, Ohio. The central cause of the Church of Jesus Christ in the 19th century was establishing a Zion society for Christ's millennial return and reign. An early attempt in Jackson County, Missouri, created religious, political, social, and economic conflicts that led to expulsion. Regardless, in 1836, Moses and Nancy decided to gather with these exiled saints and build a new life in Far West, Zion's new headquarters. Nancy gave birth to their 3rd child just as the 1838 Mormon War exploded. Moses fought at the Battle of Crooked River, a skirmish that convinced the governor to issue an extermination order, leading to the imprisonment of church leaders and the sacking of Far West. A fugitive, Moses went into hiding while Nancy lay critically ill with her 3 young sons in their home. She helplessly witnessed fellow saints endure unspeakable suffering from their fellow Americans. Mercifully, a neighbor evacuated the young family, who rendezvoused with Moses and thousands of refugees now headed to Illinois. Nancy lamented the violation of their constitutional rights. Quote, "O liberty, thou precious boon that our fathers shed their blood to gain, whither hast thou fled?" Unquote. She and Moses joined others in formally petitioning the federal government for redress. Their affidavit requested $500 in lost property and another $500 for, quote, being deprived of citizenship. However, when Joseph Smith took these petitions to Washington, D.C., President Martin Van Buren and the Congress refused to intervene on the grounds of states' rights and electoral politics. as my co-presenter Spencer McBride has argued, the states' rights strategy was as effective at denying full citizenship rights of religious minorities as it was to protecting slavery. American religious liberty was limited to traditional Protestants because Catholics, Latter-day Saints, and other religious minorities were seen as undemocratic and thus dangerous to the American experiment. Understandably, Smith and his followers began to lose confidence in the American political system. The Tracys began their third attempt at Zion in a log hut in Nauvoo, where malaria took their youngest son. In 3 years' time, however, they lived comfortably in a home overlooking the temple site, a comfort they would never know again. During that time, church leaders secured the Nauvoo Charter and Legion that allowed the saints legal self-rule and protection. Additionally, Joseph Smith formulated a political philosophy constructed from the experiences of Missouri, former revelations, and new inspiration. It was a worldview of divine governance as the inheritance of the saints in the United States, centering on two ideas, Aristarchy and Theodemocracy. Aristarchy, or government by good or excellent men, aligned with Smith's revelation to promote and vote for, quote, good, honest, and wise men, unquote. Theodemocracy, defined as when, quote, God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness for the benefit of all, end quote, expressed God's sovereignty through his chosen Aristarchic leaders, whom the people would willingly support. Joseph Smith introduced these themes in the Female Relief Society, local government elections, his presidential campaign, and the Council of 50. Nancy experienced firsthand all of these but the Council of 50. Scholars trace the political awakening of Latter-day Saint women to the Nauvoo Relief Society. In fact, Smith purposely organized the society's female leaders as an Aristarchic living constitution. Early on, they invited Nancy to join, and she reveled in the political and social space it afforded her to participate more directly in Zion. She could express her views, learn parliamentary procedures, and vote. She and her sisters affected political policy by signing a letter to the governor of Illinois, and later, Nancy personally signed another petition to the federal government. Her participation in these activities so influenced Nancy that her eldest son, Eli, though just 10 years old, could 50 years later still remember her excitement. Additionally, at the temple site across from her home, Nancy witnessed Joseph Smith nominate men for city and county political offices. Subsequently, the obedient male saints voted them into the office. What Smith and his followers saw as a theodemocratic protection of God's Zion, outsiders viewed as a threatening theocracy. As conflict emerged again, Joseph wrote to the likely candidates in the upcoming 1844 presidential election, seeking help. When none offered assistance, church leaders instead nominated Smith and began building a serious campaign. Smith and others wrote and distributed a political pamphlet titled General Joseph Smith's Views on the Powers and the Policy of the Government of the United States. Among other proposals, the pamphlet called for the president to have power to intervene within the states to protect constitutional rights. Smith called for a national political reformation, declaring the current system and leaders corrupt. If elected, he would, quote, restore the government to its pristine health and vigor, end quote. These ideas, philosophies, and wording in this document strongly influenced Nancy and her fellow saints' political understanding. On March 11th, 1844, Joseph Smith created another Aristarchic Theodemocratic living constitution, the Confidential Council of 50. Believing they were the literal kingdom of God on earth, the council orchestrated Smith's campaign while making plans to move Zion outside the nation's borders if he lost. In April, church leaders called for electioneer missionaries to canvass the nation, preaching and politicking for Smith, including using and distributing the Views pamphlet. At the height of the campaign, over 600 men served, the largest missionary force Smith ever assembled. Some of you undoubtedly in here are descendants of some of those electioneer missionaries. When I did this research, I was surprised to find out that I had one. Moses Tracy volunteered and was assigned to New York. Nancy wanted to go along, in part so the children could meet their grandparents. It seemed quite an undertaking, she admitted, but I felt equal to the task, and she was. She convinced Moses to ask Joseph Smith for permission. Smith concurred, saying Nancy would assist him on his mission. After receiving instructions from church leaders on electioneering, the Tracys departed, armed with copies of the Book of Mormon and Smith's pamphlet, and their 4 young sons under 11. As other electioneers were doing, there is evidence they preached and politicked along the way, and certainly did so once in New York. Both their families were overjoyed to see the children, but were cold to the message of Zion, except for Moses' 14-year-old brother Silas, who converted. Moses and Nancy also advocated Joseph Smith's candidacy, liberally sharing Smith's views with their families. Meanwhile, Latter-day Saint dissenters partnered with political enemies of Joseph Smith to assassinate him. When word reached the Tracys, they were horror-stricken. Nancy remembered that Moses sat, sobbing out loud, quote, "Is it true? Can it be true? When so short a time ago, he set us apart to fill this mission and was all right?" End quote. They remained in New York, continuing to preach until the following spring. Sadly, on their return journey to Nauvoo, their 1-year-old fell ill and died soon after their arrival. Latter-day Saints saw Smith's murder as a rejection of both religious and political salvation. When subsequent persecution drove them from the nation, they decided that the United States government was irredeemably corrupt. The Tracys fled Nauvoo and suffered mightily traversing Iowa. Near winter quarters, their 11-year-old took ill and died. Nancy had now lost 3 of her 6 children, each in the wake of persecution and expulsion. Even writing a half-century later, her anger towards the nation was palpable. She wrote that Joseph Smith's murder was, quote, "concocted from the official head down to the lowest demons that committed the dark deed, and this in our boasted land of liberty that our fathers fought and bled to redeem and to worship God as they chose. May the Lord have mercy on our enemies' souls for their cruelty and wickedness to an innocent and law-abiding people," end quote. Nancy and her comrades were furious that their fellow citizens and their government had once again violated their rights. She and other saints framed themselves as the true Americans who would rescue the founding ideals of the nation by establishing them anew in the West. In the 1850s, the Tracys entered the provisional state of Deseret, soon to become Utah Territory. It was an Aristarchic Theodemocracy of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo, now writ large on the Great Basin. Church leaders were nominated to serve in corresponding political offices, and the population assented by voting for them. Thus, Church President Brigham Young was also governor, the apostles served in the territorial council, and the different settlements' bishops were also mayors and judges and so on. Not surprisingly, leaders chose former electioneers for these dual roles well beyond their representation in the general male population. The Tracys settled in Ogden, and true to the electioneer Theodemocratic relationship, Lauren Farr, a fellow electioneer and stake president and mayor of Ogden, assigned Moses to the High Council and subsequently into county government roles. But what of Nancy, the lone female electioneer? Theodemocracy still inherited America's diminutive political space for women. While her cherished Theodemocratic Zion protected her freedom to worship, it still restricted her politically, at least for now. In time, non-Latter-day Saint federal officials grew uncomfortable with Utah's combination of church and state. In 1857, President James Buchanan sent a military expedition to quell a rumored rebellion. Brigham Young declared martial law, ordering those in northern Utah to escape to Utah Valley. For the Tracys, this latest exodus would again be tragic, as Moses began having strokes along the journey. It was even worse than crossing the plains, Tracy remembered. Quote, "In all our married life, ever since we joined the Church of Latter-day Saints, it had been one continual scene of persecution, traveling from one place to another to find a resting place from our enemies," end quote. Each time it had cost a family member's life, and this trip would be no exception. When word came to return home, Nancy led her family, and ironically, they arrived home from their fourth government-induced exodus on Independence Day, 1858. Moses died weeks later. Nancy felt, quote, completely worn down with toil and hardships of which my whole life had been made up after embracing the gospel. But I felt that my religion was more to me than the world, end quote. Her farm bordered that of her husband's brother, 30-year-old Silas, who already had 2 wives. Struggling to work her farm, the educated 44-year-old scriptorian Nancy reminded him of the biblical requirement to marry his brother's widow. Thus, Nancy became a plural wife in 1860 and gave birth to her last child in 1861. She found some rest and stability in plural marriage to raise her younger children, but her and her people's struggle for religious freedom continued. The Transcontinental Railroad's approach to bring more Gentiles and their culture to Utah, one way Brigham Young sought to deflect that influence was having veterans of the Nauvoo Relief Society recreate the organization in every congregation. In 1866, Eliza Snow, the new general presidentess of the Relief Society, helped organize the Marriott Ward, which chose Nauvoo veteran Nancy Tracy as first counselor. We labored energetically, Nancy recalled, being helpers to the priesthood in all we could in every way. She again relished the political and social space the renewed Relief Society gave her. For over 30 years, she donated money, food, and even land to the Relief Society for the needy, for missionaries, for temple construction, and especially for the Utah delegation of the National Women's Association. She assisted in teaching the younger sisters the parliamentary functions of the society and in encouraging them to greater spirituality and self-sufficiency. When the railroad arrived, it literally split Nancy and Silas's properties, but its influence failed to immediately split Utah's Theo from its democracy. In late 1869, the Cullum anti-polygamy bill was introduced in Congress. Relief societies immediately held indignation meetings, accusing the legislation as restricting their religious freedom to practice plural marriage. Their articulation and activism surprised even national observers. With such open political support from the women, the territorial legislature gave them the right to vote in February 1870, making Nancy and other Utahns the first women in the nation to vote. And they voted for the church candidates, further entrenching Theodemocracy. Nancy was overjoyed to join her sisters in going on the offensive in the fight for religious liberty. Throughout the next 2 decades, Nancy took an increasingly active leadership role in the Marriott Relief Society. The minutes record her teaching, encouraging, leading, and defending religious liberty. For example, she presided over a meeting where they discussed, quote, Joseph Smith offering himself for the presidency of the United States and his views and intentions if they received him, along with many other interesting remarks, end quote. She openly defended Theodemocracy, stating in one meeting that, quote, the kingdom of God will eventually govern the earth, end quote. And when attendance to the monthly meetings dipped, Nancy chastened the sisters for making excuses, declaring, quote, these relief societies were not organized for nothing. We have work to do, end quote. That work became more difficult when Nancy's second husband died in 1881, and when subsequent years brought ever stricter anti-polygamy legislation. In 1886, Congress debated the Edmunds-Tucker Act that would unincorporate the church, effectively disenfranchise Latter-day Saint men, and disenfranchise all women. Having exercised a vote for 16 years, Nancy and the Latter-day Saint women fought to keep it. Again, the relief societies were ready-made hives of political organizing. They gathered in large numbers throughout the territory and even in Washington, D.C., to protest and to petition. However, when the act passed the Senate, and with her favorite son now in prison convicted of polygamy, Nancy expressed in a meeting that she, quote, felt it was a solemn time, and there was not much time for laughter or dancing or foolishness, end quote. As the House of Representatives deliberated, Nancy contributed to a fund financing the female Latter-day Saint delegation in Washington, and prayed with her sisters that the delegation would have, quote, influence with the nation for good. All their efforts proved fruitless, and the act became law in 1887. Yet the aging Nancy kept the fight for religious liberty alive in her Relief Society. For example, she read non-Latter-day Saint Jeremiah Wilson's fiery speech to Congress defending Latter-day Saints. Yet in 1889, the Gentile Liberal Party defeated the Latter-day Saints People's Party in the Ogden elections. The next year, they would win in Salt Lake City, and the United States Supreme Court would rule the Edmunds-Tucker Act constitutional. Church President Wilford Woodruff soon announced a revelation that the church would cease plural marriage. But the end of polygamy was not enough if the Latter-day Saints wanted to be admitted as a state. The last vestige of Theodemocracy disappeared when church leaders disbanded the People's Party and directed Latter-day Saints to join the Democrat and Republican parties. In 1895, as a convention drafted the Utah Constitution, including reinstating the vote for women, Nancy wrote her third and most comprehensive reminiscence. She noted with irony that non-Latter-day Saints had established their various churches in Utah and, quote, worshiped as they pleased. But did they give us the privilege when we dwelt with them? No, verily no. We were cast out from among them, persecuted, and our leaders slain. We have not been allowed the liberty of conscience, which other people have enjoyed, and which the Constitution guarantees for us to worship as we please. It was painful for Nancy to see church members, including her own children and grandchildren, splitting into Republicans and Democrats, creating division and strife in a political realm that had only known Zion's unity for half a century. What good was statehood and reinstatement of the female franchise if she could not vote theodemocratically? What was happening was confusing and even apostate to Nancy. She had lived long enough to see the beginning of her people's longed-for and hard-fought religious liberty, but at the cost of almost everything she had struggled to build. What does it all mean, she wondered, longing for the current strife and contention to vanish, and the saints to again, quote, with one accord, vote the same ticket, end quote. Ultimately, her beliefs gave, quote, consolation and satisfaction to know that we shall eventually become the head and not the tail. This is worth living for and, if necessary, to die for, end quote. Nancy would outlive Theodemocratic Zion by only 6 years. Fittingly, she passed on March 11th, 1902, the 58th anniversary of the Council of 50, who sent her and her husband to defend religious liberty. Her grandsons and granddaughters now enjoyed the religious and political rights she had fought and suffered for. Yet, as she neared death, her thoughts turned to her female friends who had already passed. Quote, they had fought a good fight, kept the faith, and have gone from this earth to a higher and nobler sphere of action, Joseph Smith's only female electioneer penned. When my time comes, I hope to enjoy the society of these noble women and labor with them on the other side, as I have done here upon this earth. Thank you.
Well, that was fun, wasn't it? That exceeded my expectations. All right, we have the opportunity now to ask some questions. What would Nancy say today about the political climate? I would love to just... Is that okay if I do that?
Sure, I haven't talked to her lately. I've spent a lot of time thinking about her. I think she would find it quite distressful that inside the church there has arisen such animosity over political views that are partisan, that people are tending, at least what I'm seeing, tending to view even the gospel through the lens of their partisan political parties or thoughts. I think she would, as I used in my presentation, I think she would think that's apostate. that she's looking for unity. Now, of course, theodemocracy is a lot different than democracy. But as far as that general idea, I think she would be disappointed if we couldn't sit down and talk things out, as opposed to vilify one another, even inside of our own church.
Other hands, yes, please.
So, in another section, they actually read from the Missouri Constitution that there are all of these rights saved, and so it looks to me like the problem is just general lawlessness, not a lack of rights there. That people, and the Supreme Court decides whatever it decides without regard to the Constitution.
I would just add on the lawlessness part that it's a different world back then. That same summer, in Philadelphia, there are riots between Catholics and nativists who, don't want. I mean, the reason it starts is immaterial. The idea is that violence wasn't just on the frontier for political means; it existed in the whole nation against minorities. I told you of my third great grandfather, who I found out was part of the electioneer force. He was in Boston at what turned out to be the biggest political rally that the campaign ever had, which was broke up and ended in a brawl because of some Whig, what do they call them? I forgot. Yeah, they were hecklers, but there was dandies. Yeah, Whig dandy hecklers who broke up the meeting and started a fist fight. So, as Spencer was saying, the ideas not only structurally, but to say that as a Catholic, because you believe in the Pope, that's un-American. As Mormons, because you believe in Joseph Smith's authority, that's un-American. Or Quakers, because you don't believe in defending your country, that's un-American. So it's not really religion. And so in their minds, violence, if the law won't do things their way, is seen as acceptable, which is dangerous, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
First, thank you both very much for your papers. I was curious a little bit about Nancy Tracy's life and Relief Society political life after the dissolution of the People's Party, after the entry into the Union. I realized that Nancy Tracy only lives about 6 years, but you describe how when the Relief Societies are reorganized, they become a political space. They're political mobilization sort of units, in a sense, for these women. Does that persist even after the People's Party is gone and Latter-day Saints split into multiple parties, or are there any changes we should be mindful of?
Great question. It persists particularly in the sense of working for women's suffrage across the United States. So when Utah becomes a state, it becomes the third state to have women's voting, right? And so they actually start to take an even bigger role in the national association, the national suffrage movement. And as I saw in the meeting minutes, contributions that were given straight to Utah's delegation for the National Association of Women. So what we don't see, at least from what I've researched, is Relief Societies breaking down into, well, you're a Democrat, I'm a Republican, we're going to organize this half of the ward against you, or anything like that. But they do remain very politically active in trying to move the vote nationwide.
Thanks. Another question about Nancy. I actually wasn't very familiar with her story before, and it's interesting to think about her maybe in the context of other like sister missionaries, and if this moves the timeline of when we think about women representing the church and kind of Latter-day Saint interests outside of their communities, right? And then also in general just women's participation in politics that doesn't have a lot of direct entry into voting rights. And so, we think about the Council of 50 and the exclusion of women, participants being told not to talk to their wives about it, and then her participation of it. And I guess what I'm saying is, for her proximity in these two ways, I guess, how what does she show us more about the spaces that women have occupied and the timelines in which that happened and occurred?
I think the scholarship has been moving up the date as far as women pushing the edge of political activity within the spheres that they could, right? It's pretty much universally accepted that the Relief Society is kind of the beginning of that political awakening for Latter-day Saint women. I would also say that as far as moving up the timeline with missionary work, Lucy Mack Smith goes with Hiram up in Detroit in the early 1830s, and according to her, she preaches. And so it's kind of a difficult thing to nail down because, do they have to have a specific call? Do they have to, you know what I mean? And whereas, because there were actually a few other wives that traveled with their husbands, but none of them, we don't have any record of any of them preaching and politicking like Nancy did. And you can tell from not only before she left on this mission, but after, that was part of her makeup. That was part of who she was. And so I think it's worth exploring more and more the women before the suffrage movement, right, in relief societies. I still think there's a lot to be done with a lot of records that exist of minutes of relief societies. I just looked at one and one stake minute book, and there was a ton there. So there's your dissertation or whatever.
There you go. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, in this same theme, I've just often, and so I want a confirmation if I'm on the right track. We know Wyoming women get the first voting rights. Do Utah women just overflow into Wyoming to influence more of these very frontier women to be able to vote because Wyoming is a state and Utah, Deseret just isn't yet? How much influence do LDS women here in Utah have on the first voting women in Wyoming?
Not much. Wyoming's still a territory.
But isn't that where the women first got to vote?
Yes, the legislature there gives them, it's in the West, right, where Eastern Moors aren't, so strong and established that these things come forward. We're actually the first to have women vote just because we have an election sooner. But as far as immediate influence on the Latter-day Saint woman in Utah to the women in Wyoming, I don't see a connection.
Thank you.
All right. Let's go ahead and end there. We want to, just for a minute, thank our panelists one more time, please.